Welcome. Hello, hello, hello.
Hi.
If you are wondering what's going on and you don't have a seat, you're welcome to join. This is a free public event. This is Pro-Con at the Pier. We're going to have a pro and con debate about whether to desalinate. Desalinate the water in the Pacific Ocean that surrounds us. Today is the third of 4 debates that we've held this month. Last week was a debate on rent control. The week before was about California's marijuana legalization policies. And next week is about whether or not to abolish ICE. Today we're going to focus on water, and we are being live streamed on Facebook. This debate is being video recorded onto YouTube, and we have what looks like about close to 150 people in the audience here today. Today's event is brought to you courtesy of the Arthur and Rupe Foundation. They believe strongly, like we do, that the world needs more debate. The reason we are presenting Pro and Con is because procon.org is the host. Procon.org presents pro and con research on controversial issues. That's what we do. And the reason we do it is so that people can have access to both sides of a debate so they can make their own informed decisions. That's how we think the world ought to work, but it's awfully hard to find competing views. We're so in our echo chambers, so Pro-Con is here to burst them. So today we're going to be exposing you to a range of opinion on the water desalination issue so that you can make your own informed decision, whatever that may be. Today's hashtag, if you are on social media, is hashtag civil discourse. You can use whatever other hashtag you want, but we ask if you do tweet, use that one too. If you have not already done so, you can vote on today's topic before the debates, whether or not you think desalination is a part of LA's water future. And then after today's debate, we ask you to do the same. We'll see if opinion has shifted one way or the other. If you've had a chance to check out the other folks that are here with us today, there's a civic engagement fair. We're so lucky. The California Secretary of State's office is here. They're doing voter registration. They're doing voter pre-registration. If you're 16 and a half years old in the state of California, you can register to vote. So by the time you're 18, boom, it takes effect. So they're there giving away all kind of swag. We encourage you to check out their booth. Right next to them is an organization called The Constituents. Their job is to help all of us figure out who our elected officials are, state senators, state assembly person, local elected officials, and not just find out who they are, but you can write a postcard to them with what you think on an issue, and they'll pay for the stamp and mail it for you. So make sure you visit their booth too to sound off to your local electeds. Thank you, constituents. And next to them, folks, is the Santa Monica Public Library. Not a lot of cities have a pop-up library. Santa Monica does. If you want to check out a book today, whether you are a resident of Santa Monica or not, you can go there and actually check out a book right now on a water topic. They brought all their water books in that boat here today. I also would like to acknowledge the Santa Monica Pier. This pier that we're standing on is 109 years old. It is a historic venue. We're so thankful that we get to share this space to talk about public policy in a very public space. By the way, folks, if you're just arriving, you're welcome to join us. This is a free public event. Please join. I also finally want to thank the Pro-Con staff that helped organize this. Tracy, who helped put so much of the event together. Jeannie Ring, our Director of Development, is here. There's Deborah and Kate in the Pro-Con booth. I think we've got Sahira, who's managing our social media. Natalie is managing our camera. Jeff here, who's our timer. And we have former intern Clint is here as well. So it's good to see old family as well. Now, folks, Pro-Con's a little different because we try to make complex public policy issues very accessible, even fun. We needed some help in the fun department, so we started looking around for who might be really fun, funny, and I'm so excited to announce our moderator for tonight is someone you may have seen, may have heard. It's a stand-up comic by the name of Toby Muresianu.
Muresianu, but close.
Just like I said, Muresianu. Toby is someone who hosts a great podcast called Up Close and Political. It's a podcast that's also a program at the Hollywood Improv here in Los Angeles. Toby started as a software engineer at Brown University. Yes, he's an Ivy Leaguer. Yes, he's very smart. He parlayed that degree into a career at Microsoft, where he's a software engineer for them, then went independent for a while, ran his own business, and then decided that wasn't enough. He wanted to go into stand-up comedy. As a stand-up comedy, he has now performed on so many of the major comedy festivals. He has performed in over 19 different countries, and of course the Up Close and Political show is a very popular show. We're thrilled, folks. You're going to have a great time with Toby leading today's discussion on water desalination. Toby, it's your show. Thank you, folks. Enjoy your evening.
Beautiful candy, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you guys so much, and just give yourselves a round of applause for coming out here tonight. You guys are like the all-stars, I think, of civil debate. When you ask an average person on the sidewalk what gets you out of bed in the morning, what's the most controversial issue of our time, most of them probably will not say water desalination. But you guys realize how important it is, as do I. It has a lot of personal importance for me. I am actually myself nearly 80% water on my mom and father's side, so I have a long history. They said, what debate do you want to do? Do you want to moderate the debate on marijuana or water? I said, not marijuana, because you know what? Push comes to shove, I can survive 48 hours without legal marijuana. Water? No, we're all dead. And it's kind of a testament to how amazing our engineering is that we can take water for granted. It comes out whenever we turn on the tap, but it might not be that way forever. I mean, you look on the news and you hear news about climate change and sustainability, and it becomes sort of an issue of concern. So people are wondering, like, what should we be doing to make sure we can have water in the future, you know? Should we stop drinking almond milk? Should we buy a discount from Flint, Michigan? Or should we just try to make use of that? Should we turn that into this? And that's the technology called desalination, which is now being used around the world. It's popular in the Middle East. There's many plants in Asia and South America. And actually in Carlsbad, California, there's now the largest desalination plant in the Western Hemisphere. So if you are here as a tourist, skip SeaWorld, just check that out. That's what I say. Desalination is basically technology that sucks in seawater, filters it through a membrane, turns it into potable water, and then discharges the the saltier water that's left over into the ocean. If I'm wrong about this, that's why you're here. And so yeah, to discuss the positives and negatives of that technology, I'm joined by two fabulous experts here. Right here we have Tracy Quinn. She is the director of the California Water Conservation and Efficiency, Healthy People and Thriving Communities. That is a longer title than my last name. I appreciate that. At the National Resource Defense Council. She's also a former civil engineer. Give her a round of applause. And on my right, we have Eric Hoek. Is that correct? He is a professor at UCLA teaching civil and environmental engineering. He is also the editor-in-chief of the NPJ Clean Water Journal. And give him a round of applause, make him feel welcome. And so the way this will work is we'll each have opening statements, then there will be about a 20-minute debate where I have some questions prepared, and then we're going to open it up to all you guys. So raise your hands and you all have an opportunity to ask your own questions and interact with these guys. We have our timekeeper up here who's going to be keeping each of the responses to 2 minutes. And as the moderator, it's just my job to make sure none of your responses get too salty. That all your arguments hold water. And if you're sick of my puns, don't worry, we're all in the same boat. So that's all it takes. All right, and now without further ado, I'm going to give it over to Tracy. Oh, sorry, I stand corrected. Give it over to Eric for his opening statement on whether or not desalinating water is a good solution for Los Angeles.
Thank you, Toby. Thank you all for attending, and Tracy, look forward to hearing your perspectives. So Los Angeles gets about 10% of its drinking water from local groundwater. About 90% is imported, and it comes from three major sources. First is the Los Angeles Aqueduct, which starts in the Owens River and collects water from the Sierra Nevadas down to Los Angeles. The second is the Colorado River Water Authority, which brings water in from Lake Havasu. The third is the State Water Project, which brings water all the way down from the San Francisco-Sacramento Bay Delta. And that water travels over 400 miles to get here. It has to be lifted over a mountain range to get to Los Angeles, and the lift requirement requires 1 million horsepower of pumping capacity. The amount of electricity consumed in getting that water to Los Angeles could power 600,000 homes for a year. I'm going to take an extra 5 seconds for that. And we can now do seawater desalination for less energy and at lower cost than it takes to import water from Northern California. Imported water stresses the local ecosystems at the points of origin, consumes vast amount of energy and cost, is subject to reductions during periods of droughts, and is constantly under threat due to concerns over these ecosystem impacts, seismic events, and other concerns. So, as our population here continues to grow and expand, the water demand is going to grow and expand with it. And local water resource programs such as conservation, water recycling, groundwater recovery and storage, and desalination will all be important for LA to diversify its water resource portfolio towards more reliable and sustainable approach. You can't store, bank, or trade fresh water if you don't have it. Conservation and water recycling are critical, but as we use less water, we have less wastewater to recycle. It also becomes more difficult, more energy intense, and expensive to do. So do we give up? No. We should always use less, reuse and recycle any valuable natural resource. But I'm going to make the case today that desalination can and will play a pivotal role in the future of Los Angeles and Southern California's water resource management portfolio. Thank you.
Cool, thank you very much. Now, Tracy, your response?
First of all, thank you all for coming out, and thank you for being the kind of people that care about water. Here in California, water is an incredibly wonky and contentious issue, but in a state prone to drought, it's also a critical one. We need to make smart decisions so that we have enough clean water for our growing population and a thriving community. Water is also an issue that is near and dear to my heart, especially this coastline here. I grew up just south of here in Anaheim and spent a lot of time at SoCal beaches. In fact, my nickname growing up was Tadpole because my parents had a tough time keeping me out of the water. It was my passion for water and my desire to protect the things that gave me so much joy as a child that motivated me to study engineering at Cornell and to become an environmentalist. Now in my role as the Director of Water Conservation and Efficiency at the Natural Resources Defense Council, my goal is to find solutions for California's growing water woes that ensure a safe, reliable, and affordable supply of water for all Californians to sustain us through the impacts of climate change and the really intense and long droughts that we're going to face in the coming years. I'm sure many of you are looking to the vast ocean behind us, and you see an endless supply of drought-proof drinking water. But there are good reasons why Los Angeles has not invested in desalination yet. Despite improvements in technology and efforts to mitigate the environmental impacts, ocean desalination is still the most expensive, most energy intensive, most climate impacting, and most environmentally destructive new supply of water. Like Eric, I agree that a goal of being independent from imported water is important. And luckily for us, there are a lot of local alternatives for us to invest in that not only are cheaper, they're faster to produce, they create local jobs, and they have incredible benefits for our communities and the environment. For example, water conservation and efficiency. During our last drought, the water that we conserved saved more energy than all of the state's energy efficiency programs combined, and at a fraction of the cost. Similarly, capturing stormwater for new supply reduces the pollution in our rivers, our ocean, and on our beaches. Water reliability is important, but it's just as important that we protect the affordability of water by prioritizing investments in cost-effective solutions first. For this reason, we should only invest in ocean desalination as a last resort once all other supplies have been exhausted. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, and now let's get into the questions. So I think that's a great segue. Is ocean desalination a cost-effective and practical solution to water issues, or do you think that there are other ones like conservation that just simply make more economic sense?
Yeah, it's all relative. Desalinated seawater costs about a half a cent per liter. How much does this cost per liter? $2? So it's all a matter of perspective. It's about what choices you have as alternatives. And we do have alternative choices, many of which are lower cost, lower energy. I would argue that many of which, depending on the situation, can be higher cost and more environmentally disruptive and damaging. But it's very situational. And every case that I've seen, every utility, every municipality that I've ever worked with, they tend to want to explore every possible option, and they do pursue desalination as a last resort.
So what percentage of water do you think that desalination can realistically supply for a city like Los Angeles?
Theoretically or practically?
Well, I mean, like, what would you target as, you know, the goal?
It probably is, if we stay away from whether you're for it or against it, practically speaking, it's not going to be cost effective to desalinate seawater here and pipe it, 60 or 80 miles inland. That's not really a viable option. So you're really talking about the coastal population being served by the potential of seawater desalination, which is a significant majority of the population.
Okay, cool. And well, how would you respond to that? Do you think that the cost issue is sort of not as big as you might think because, in the grand scheme of things, water is still a cheap liquid? Or I'm guessing you disagree with that, and I'm curious why.
Well, you don't have to look too far to see what the cost impacts of desalination are. The two places closest to us that have built desalination plants, Santa Barbara and San Diego, or the plant in Carlsbad, have some of the most expensive water in the country. You compare that, I think the average ocean desal is about $2,000 to $3,000 an acre foot. You compare that to water efficiency, that's about less than $500. The added benefit of investing in conservation or efficiency first is that it's usually something like incentives or rebates for you to get a new clothes washer, a new dishwasher, a new shower head, things that help you save money on your utility bills and help your water supplier in your community save water, offsetting the stuff that you would be importing from other places or investing in desal. So, and then the more you find those local alternatives like efficiency, stormwater capture, recycling water, if you do have to go to desal as a last resort, that means you can make that facility a lot smaller, which means it's going to be a lot more affordable. And I think that we need to be prioritizing the affordability first.
So I hear it's okay.
So I agree with
street rules, guys.
I agree with most of what you said. One of the issues, though, is there is an economy of scale that's achieved with larger plant sizes. And so if you're going to do a desal project, it ends up more or less being less expensive the bigger the plant you build. And so if you seek to build a smaller plant, it will necessarily, per unit volume of water processed, more expensive. So that's the flip side. Now, should we do conservation? Of course we should. Right? And again, it's when you have no other choice, it's neither expensive nor cheap to desalination. It simply is what it is.
Well, and I'll ask a tag on a little follow-up questions to that. We hear a lot talk about conservation. How effective are conservation efforts in terms of actually getting people to change their habits when you try to implement them at a city or state level?
Well, there are two kinds of conservation. There's behavioral changes, asking people to take shorter showers and turn off the water when they brush their teeth. But the most successful strategies are those that don't require us to do much. So it's changing out your 3.5 gallon per flush toilet for one that's 1.2 gallons per flush. No change for you, but you're saving a ton of water. And I think one of the biggest opportunities that we have here in Southern California to reduce our water use is to transform our landscapes away from really thirsty lawns and towards more climate appropriate, drought tolerant landscapes. And about half of our drinking water is used to keep our landscapes alive here in Southern California. Grass is actually the largest crop in America, and we really need to move away from that. We could save a ton of water and be a lot more sustainable if we just transitioned our landscapes.
Cool. As someone who has plunged a lot of 1.8 gallon toilets, I will say there is a slight difference. But thank you very much. And I'll start off with you for the next question, which is, what is the 10 to 20-year outlook for water in California? You know, we hear a lot about talk about climate change, and how are we actually going to see that happen? And in light of that, do you think that there is importance to have a local resource, or how would you see it as? How would you see the right solution for providing that?
Well, researchers at UCLA, folks that Eric probably works with, have shown that what climate change is likely to bring are larger swings in what we've traditionally seen in California. So we don't have typical water years. There's no normal water year in California. We have droughts, and then we have a lot of rain. And so what we're going to see is more intense rain, more intense drought and precipitation, or more intense precipitation, and then longer and more intense droughts. And you know, we just experienced the worst drought in modern history here in California, ending in 2015, and I think we're likely to see another one.
Cool. And I'm going to throw it over to you. What do you think? Do you agree with or disagree with the prediction of how it's going to look in 10, 20 years? And what do you think?
Yeah, generally speaking, climate change, hotter hot and wetter wet is kind of the way it goes. Over the last decade, we've seen the cost of water increase by about 80%, 80. And I think that's to be expected. It's going to continue, maybe not in exactly the same trajectory, but it's going to continue to get more and more expensive. There's less water available, there are reductions being demanded during particularly drought years, and when there are environmental implications of importing the water. That imported water supply is under threat. And I'm going to get back to this idea about the water that we use in LA. Approximately, and you said about half, it's about 60% of the water in the city of Los Angeles is used for landscape irrigation, growing grass in the desert. You want to cut our water demand in half, make that illegal. It's very simple. You want to cut California's water demand by vast amounts, make flood irrigation illegal. Right? We can grow crops, we have the technology to grow crops without using flood irrigation. Flood irrigation, you lose, in most cases, 2/3 of the water to evaporation. It's terribly wasteful. 80% of the water in California goes towards growing food crops. Okay? So, if you're talking about an office building and you want to conserve water consumption in an office building, about 80% of the water consumed in an office building that ends up in the sewer is from toilet flushing. In the home, it's not the case. More than half is for watering your grass. Okay? So we can get this much benefit from low flush toilets, right? From changing our behaviors, taking shorter showers, and we should, because it's the right thing to do. Okay? But we ought to be targeting the biggest pieces of the pie, not the smallest pieces of the pie, to get the greatest gains and make our investments there. Cool.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, I only answered the first part of that question. The other thing that's going to happen with climate change is it's going to get hotter, right? It's already getting hotter. And that means that our lawns, our landscapes are going to require even more water to stay alive. And so that's why transitioning away from them is so important. So I think, what do we do when we see these wild swings in our climate? Well, obviously, if it's going to rain more, we should do a better job of capturing it. Stormwater is the #1 source of pollution in our ocean. And if we capture that, it's an incredible resource for Southern California. I also think that, you know, what we talked about before, conservation and efficiency. And while that does mean we'll have less water to recycle, and that's going to change what our wastewater looks like and make it a little bit more challenging, it's also really important that we recycle the water that we're right now dumping into the ocean. So the proposal would be for desalination is we're going to take our wastewater, we're going to dump it into the ocean. We're going to locate a desal plant right next to it. So we're going to pull up that water now with the added benefit of salt, which makes it way more expensive and way more energy intensive to treat. And so with climate change, we want to move away from things that are energy intensive and focus on the things that are going to really help us to mitigate the impacts of climate change.
Okay. And I'm just going to check on
10 minutes left.
About 10 minutes? Okay, great. So I think that segues nicely into the next question, which was, what would the environmental impact of a desalination plant here be? I know a lot of us might want to go swimming and probably not in a bunch of wastewater. So what would you say to those concerns that it's going to harm the
Sorry to
environment?
disappoint you, but you're already swimming in wastewater. That's because we don't recycle enough of it, to be clear. And as you leave here today, one of the greatest examples of stormwater capture and repurposing in principle is right here at the front end of the pier. It's called the SMRF, the Santa Monica Urban Runoff Facility, Runoff Recycling Facility. Great piece of infrastructure.
What would the environmental impact?
Okay, so there's three environmental impacts of a seawater desal plant. There's on the intake, you have what's called impingement and entrainment, predominantly of non-motile species, sort of embryonic and early stage sea creatures that can't swim very fast. Okay? Fish, the intake screens that are designed now with low enough flows such that an adult fish can just swim away. Right? They don't get impacted. But there are creatures that do get taken in, they get chewed up by the pumps and they die. And we want to minimize that. The energy demand and the carbon footprint associated with a desalination plant is an environmental concern. And we typically, to build a plant in California, we have to invest in carbon offset projects. So you have to invest money that doesn't go to pay for the plant, but it goes to pay for the carbon footprint of the plant in a project that would offset that carbon footprint. And then once as you described desalination, we take the water in, about half of the water gets forced through the membrane, and the other half is just a more concentrated version of seawater that goes back out. And if that concentration, if you squeeze too much water out, the concentration gets too high, you'll again have impacts, growth rates, reproductive rates, on the kinds of marine organisms that live in the coastal zone that don't swim. Stars, urchins, things like this. But if you keep the recovery, keep the amount of water you push through the plant to get clean water, if you keep it low enough, you can really greatly minimize and mitigate those impacts as well. So these are the three major impacts: the intake, the brine discharge, and the energy and the carbon. We know what they are, and we know how to mitigate them. And in California, you can't build a desalination plant unless you have effectively mitigated them and satisfied all of the various stakeholders with an interest in a project like that.
Cool. So just a little quick follow-up. I've read a lot online about people saying, oh, there's this next generation technology that'll be, even safer for marine organisms, or there's ones that are, entirely solar powered or something like that. Is there a need to start right now with today's technology, or would it be beneficial to wait a few years maybe and use some of the next generation stuff that's more energy efficient or safer? This is a follow-up to you, and then I'll come to you with the original question.
So I'm a technology guy, so what I can say is the state-of-the-art technology is one of the most efficient technologies that you would encounter on a day-to-day basis. It's about 80 to 90% of the theoretical maximum efficiency is where a seawater desalination plant operates at. So further investment, we're talking about efficiency, we're talking about energy efficiency. And the water quality that we get out of a seawater desalination plant, it rivals or is better than the quality that we get from our imported water sources. It's actually more healthful, and it operates so efficiently that waiting for future investments to develop the technology are practically unnecessary, because the incremental advances that will be made using technology that we rely on today, reverse osmosis, will not yield significant benefits in our lifetime. Now, there is always the chance that somebody comes up with a better mousetrap and figures out a completely different way. You can't beat thermodynamics, but you can process in a different way. All right, and so the potential exists for a game changer.
Cool. Okay. And I'll throw it over to you. What do you think the environmental impact of a desalination plant would be, and do you think that further technologies could mitigate that, or do you think that it's a non-starter?
Well, I think Eric characterized the environmental impacts of desalination pretty well. But it's, it just seems crazy to me that, you know, we're talking about, well, what's a reasonable number of marine life that we should kill, both with the intakes and with the brine discharge. And when there are alternatives that don't kill any marine life and in fact have positive impacts for our environment. So, you know, that's concerning. We talk about, well, yeah, it's really energy intensive, but we're gonna offset that by making investments or paying off, buying offsets for renewables. Well, those renewables could be used to offset existing fossil fuel dependency rather than creating new fossil fuel dependency. Desalination is still an unexpected load on our local grids, many of which are already constrained. Here in Southern California, SCE and SD, San Diego Gas and Electric, were just recently authorized to add more than 5,000 megawatts for the coastal areas just to meet projected demand, not including desalination plants. So there are better opportunities out there. And renewables, while much better than fossil fuels, still have an environmental and economic impact. You know, solar takes a lot of land. You know, there are impacts to wind and other renewables. So I think it's, you know, it's better for us to prioritize things that aren't as energy intensive rather than looking for offsets first. What was the second part? Oh,
would better technology mitigate that if it becomes more efficient in the future? Would that change your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, if there were ways to mitigate this. I mean, you know, they've looked at things like requiring subsurface intakes, so you're reducing or eliminating the marine life that's being killed when you're pulling the water in. Looking at discharging the brine in the tidal pools using diffusers, so there's less of an impact. But while there are still opportunities for us to invest in things that we don't have to worry about those, it doesn't make sense. Yes, if we were to be able to have desalination that was as, you know, could match cost with some of our other supplies, then certainly, but until then, you know, I think that we need to really focus our investments. You know, there is no all of the above. You know, everyone says, well, let's just do everything. And we don't have the resources or the political will to do everything. We've seen places, like in San Diego where they made heavy investments in their Carlsbad desal plant. And that made it much more difficult for them to invest in conservation. Places where you have big infrastructure, that's a huge capital cost, and then the ratepayers have to pay for it. So you have to sell a certain amount of water. It makes other options much more difficult to pursue when you pursue the most costly first.
Cool. And I just want to say, yeah, I appreciate you guys getting into it. You know, if you want to cheer a point or boo or, you know, start the wave, you know, that's just appropriate. And this is going to be the last question that's part of my little bit, and then we're going to go to audience Q&A. So if you have something on your mind, you know, formulate that into a question, and we'll get to you soon. And so this, for the last one, I wanted to mention, or bring it back to the Carlsbad plant, which, again, the biggest in the Western Hemisphere, just opened up about a year ago, I think, maybe 2 years ago, down in San Diego. Has that been successful, and what can we learn from that?
Yeah, so we know that it works. It produces the quality of water that was specified, and they're selling it to the city at the price point that they agreed on. It took them 16 years to develop the project, roughly, and they really were experiencing everything for the first time. And so we at least now have a roadmap for how to do a desalination project in California. So was it a success? I think it's all a matter of perspective, right? The people in San Diego have clean, fresh water to drink at a price point that apparently was acceptable. On the other side, there have been some operational challenges, and the folks who actually own the plant or running it might not be making as much money as they thought they would. So, again, all a matter of perspective.
I'd heard people saying that there was like because they have a guaranteed purchases by the county, I believe, and but the city of San Diego itself doesn't have to purchase the water, that they ended up with buying a lot more water than they needed, and it was kind of a sunk expense. Obviously there's some difference there's a natural cycle of drought and rain, but was that sort of something that they would do differently in retrospect?
Yeah, and probably, right? And this is how you structure a contract, right? So it's legal work. It's not my expertise, but I would say that from a technological perspective, it's a pretty good plan. It's a great example of how to do things right, how to make attempts to satisfy all of the stakeholders to try to do the right thing from an environmental perspective. And at the end of the day, as you opened up with, we need fresh water, and when there is not an alternative freshwater source, it's the only option. So when it's the only option, you just don't have any alternatives.
Fair enough. All right, and what do you think? What's your perspective on the operation of the Carlsbad plant so far?
Well, I think what happened during the drought, where San Diego was forced to continue to pay for desalinated water when they didn't need it, and so they were treating desalinated water and then dumping it in a reservoir where it needed to be treated again, because conservation and efficiency efforts had been so successful during the drought. I think what that shows is that San Diego probably could have done a better job of investing in conservation and efficiency and exhausting that before moving to desalination. You know, they have some great projects down there called Pure Water, where they're recycling their wastewater to drinking water quality, much like they do in Orange County. And you know, I think focusing on that, seeing where that got them before investing in desalination, probably would have been a wiser choice, so that folks in San Diego didn't have to pay for some of the most expensive water in the country.
And do you think that there's a real threat, though, that at some point, if maybe there's a disaster, maybe an earthquake breaks pipelines or something like that, that there could be a situation where you have no other alternative but desal?
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, trying to be independent from imported water is, is likely very wise, given that much of our water in California comes from the Sierra snowpack, which is estimated to be reduced by 60 to 85% by the end of the century. So it's wise to look at local alternatives, but I think that recycling wastewater, conservation, stormwater, the things that we've talked about before, would have been wiser before investing in desalination.
Okay. All right, well, now it's time for audience Q&A. So, all right, we got a handful already, and what's that? Okay, all right. So, be sure to ask your question, and let's start off with this. Oh, he already walked to the back. Let's get this gentleman in the front. Got here early, front row center. I respect it. Let's start off with you.
Okay, I'm just going to really bullet point.
And just see how lucky we are. Some people couldn't get tickets and were forced to rent helicopters just to see this for a little bit.
That's a whole other topic entirely. Okay, let me say first off that I'm both pro and con on this side, okay? I'm pro desalinization, but the plant in Santa Barbara and the other one near San Onofrio are the nuclear approach. And as Albert Einstein said, nuclear power is a very expensive way to boil water. So, and then a second point is we're looking at another issue here, which is the CEO of Nestle said that water is not a human right. He's gone on record as saying this. So, and I've been a professional driver, and driving in the hills of Hollywood, you see an entitled level of water usage that is not going to anywhere be close to conservation, because there is, I mean, the whole reason why Mulholland is there is because rich people wanted to be able to transform the desert into the East Coast. And no matter how we try and get people to use appropriate landscape, they just don't want to do it. I live... Yes, I'm getting to it. So the question is where do we find the balanced approach? Because obviously conservation works to a certain extent but doesn't really. Desalinization works to a certain extent but doesn't really. You know, we need to find a third way of, getting there.
So what do you think?
There's only one freshwater source that increases with population and industrialization, and that's wastewater. So, first and foremost, we need to recycle more water. The challenge to doing that often, because recycled water, we can take any quality of water and turn it into any other quality of water. We have the technology, we have the analytical capabilities of verifying it, assuring it. That's not an issue. The issue is, one, are you willing to pay for it? And two, do we have a regulatory framework that permits a certain end use of it? And today, one could argue that there are loopholes, but you cannot legally repurpose municipal wastewater for drinking water directly. We have to do it indirectly, which means we have to essentially desalinate it. Same technology we use for converting ocean water to drinking water, we use for converting wastewater to drinking water. Then we have to pay to power pumps to drive it deep into the earth and let it sit there for 6 months to 2 years to magically let nature cleanse it. Then we have to pay for more pumps to lift it back up out of the earth and deliver it to a surface water treatment plant where we have to pay again to treat the water. Okay? Now, it's now proven fact that the water we're putting in the ground in these aquifer recharge projects is more pure than the water in the aquifer itself. Okay? So, there is a movement now to try to develop a regulatory framework to enable direct potable reuse. But until that happens, there are going to be situations where a certain utility or municipality doesn't have the real estate to locate a recycling facility just over the fence from a wastewater treatment plant. And they're going to have to pay to pipe the water miles to a spot where you can treat it. And you have to pay to pipe the water miles again to where it needs to be used. And that is one of the reasons why municipalities might look into desalination, because they have physical, geographical constraints that don't permit them to do it cost effectively. You also need to have favorable hydrogeology. You need to have a way to put the water in the ground to store it, right, with the right hydrogeology to get it back out, unimpaired. And not every location has access to the hydrogeology, the proximity, to be able to do a recycling project cost effectively. So, what are you left with? We do conservation. Everybody does conservation first, there's no doubt. We look at groundwater trading, banking and trading with other agencies, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And eventually, you have no alternatives, and the only one on the table that's pursuable is desalination. That's why you built a plant, because you've done everything else first.
I'm just curious, why is it so hard to overcome that regulatory headache of having to pipe water here, there, and everywhere instead of treating it more directly? Who are are there particular lobbies that are obstructing that, or what's the inertia that needs to be overcome?
So, it's been called the yuck factor. Toilet to tap was a phrase that was coined in some political election some time ago. And it became highly politicized to try to reuse and recycle municipal wastewater as part of the drinking water supply. And it's taken a long, long time for the public, I think, to get over that. The reality is there are risks to recycling wastewater. In my 20 years of working on all aspects of water treatment, there have been new, we call it emerging contaminants, discovered about every so many years. There's a new one that pops up. Okay? And the reason why we didn't know about them before and we know about them now could be we didn't have the analytical tools available to us 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and now a new instrument is developed and it allows us to quantify that there's something there that we didn't know used to be there. Okay? So the risks, there are implied and there are inherent risks to recycling wastewater. Beyond just the pathogens, the yuck factor, there are contaminants of emerging concern that seem to continuously crop up. And we don't have such contaminants at levels that are detectable in seawater. And we do have a legal framework for turning seawater directly into drinking water.
Yeah. So what do you think? Is there a third way? And do you agree with what he's saying? And then we'll go to another question. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think within conservation and efficiency, you have a lot of tools at your disposal, right? You can set price signals to encourage people to conserve. You can change building codes so that new and redeveloped buildings only have efficient plumbing fixtures and appliances. You can have local ordinances that require that any new or redeveloped landscapes have to operate efficiently and can't have more than 25% lawn. You can do things like they're doing in San Francisco, where they have on-site reuse districts where buildings can, some of those new high-rises that are going up, they'll treat the gray water and sometimes the black water, and they have a legal framework now where buildings can share that water and they can use it for toilet flushing and other non-potable sources. We can do gray water reuse at our homes. You know, I don't think we're ever going to get the folks in Bel Air to take out their lawns, or at least not all of them, but we can charge them enough to help to fund some of the conservation and efficiency and new supplies that we need to do to be sustainable.
All right. Let me take a question from that guy, and then we'll get to you next.
Thank you so much for having this debate. It's very important. So I guess my question is for both of you. I guess for Eric, we're talking about two things when we talk about water desalination. There's the salt and the water, right? We're talking about getting fresh water out of salt water. So we've talked a lot about the water side of it, and I'm just curious, is there a technological way to remove to capture the salt from it? And if so, is there anything good that we can do with that salt? And if so, I guess for you, Tracy, is there anything that would be mitigatingly beneficial of capturing that salt from the ocean that might make it seem more environmentally feasible? I'm just curious, because we're not talking about the salt we're getting out of the process, so maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a brackish water desalination plant in the state of Texas that has invested in a salt recovery process that actually captures the salt, dry salt, and actually in different forms can separate out different salts. And then some of it's used for road salt, some of it's used for other feedstocks. It's a very unique situation, but it can be done. More often than not, it's not cost effective because salt is not a very high value product. So the effort and the cost of going all the way to getting dry salt tends not to be able to be paid for in going to try to resell that salt. So when someone's making an investment in a plant, right, you're going to make your investment decisions on your return and the payback. So not to say it can't be done, it can be done, but it's, I would say, less commonly pursued.
Cool. What do you think?
What he said.
All right, fair enough. All right, I signaled her out first.
I guess this is mostly directed at Eric, because you mentioned, which I think is really important, that 80% of the water used in California is for agriculture. And then you said that they use a very wasteful method of using water, which I think you call flood irrigation. And so two questions. Why are they using such a wasteful method of growing things? And the second question is, how can we get them to stop?
First question is a lot easier than the second question. So without getting into the weeds, literally, flood irrigation is used because it enables the water to infiltrate evenly through the subsurface to reach all of the root zones in a field. If you apply drip irrigation, water tends to sort of funnel into a cone and it doesn't spread laterally. And so you don't reach all of the roots. You have to go to extra efforts to create that lateral infiltration to make drip irrigation more efficient. Can be done, it just requires an investment up front to do it right. How do we get people to change? I mean, that's a human nature question, right? So, my experience, you have to either make something illegal or make something so expensive that there's an inherent incentive to not do it. Otherwise, it's very difficult, you know, broadly speaking, to get populations to change behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I think our agriculture can obviously use water more efficiently. I think we face difficulty in requiring or incentivizing them to do so because of our water rights structure, and a lot of agriculture has a use it or lose it water right, and you know, they also are faced with infrastructure issues. Some farms only get the water when it's their turn, not when their crop needs it. We don't have pressurized systems, so things like drip irrigation and other things, you know, would be really expensive to do. Not that we can't do them, but we just have to find a way to pay for them, and we can make our farms a lot more efficient.
Cool. I think we have time for one final question, and we'll determine who gets to ask it with a wrestling match. So I saw you first. There will be, I believe, a reception afterwards, so if you don't get a chance to ask, Ken will give you the details on that as soon as we wrap up. But for now, let's give this guy a chance to ask a question.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tracy and Eric, for these reflections and perspectives on a very complex issue. I think for me, just a quick statement and then a very laser question. You know, for me, if we look at water as the next oil war, right, in terms of our future with climate change and our instability of climate change, especially here in these, you know, certain environments, 75% of our planet is surrounded by a resource with water. So for me, I think desalination is in the future. The question is when and what's the timing of that? And economic disruption of usually 5x is what's needed to make that viable right now, because we have carbon footprint issues, energy issues of pumping, and our energy sources are inefficient in relation to the efficiency of this process. So my question is what technologies are you aware of, both on the carbon footprint side? Scandinavia's done some great work with flow generators using the power of the oceans and the tides to create energy to naturally drive these with virtually zero environmental impact and not taking up the space of solar. And number two, through advanced materials like graphene oxide, through nanostructures that can still have more flow and the ability to bind to these particular agents that we're trying to get rid of, either biological or you know, other dangerous materials. So my question is what new technologies do you see? What ramp up technology time, and how are those getting funded to solve this problem in a way that makes it economically viable?
So the reason why you're seeing desalination plants being built now is because it's gone through literally a 60-year development cycle, 2 generations of R&D. The first commercially viable reverse osmosis members were invented and patented by UCLA in 1959. Developed through the 60s, then by industry in the 70s and 80s. It was a niche technology that was utilized only when absolutely nothing else could be utilized until the 90s. And the market, if you will, really broke in the last 20 years. So any new technology in water, particularly when you're producing drinking water and where protecting public health is of paramount importance, is going to be a generational effort at a minimum to get it developed, commercialized, proven. The engineers who have to design the plants to be confident that they can design a plant that will work, that they can stamp, right, and hold the liability on whether it works or not. The developers are going to risk the financial investments on a new technology versus a proven technology. I think the time frame is generational. There's a lot of hype around desalination in the last decade or two, new technologies. What I can say is, if you're going to use a process that looks anything like reverse osmosis, there's only 10 or 20% improvement that one can make, no matter what the tool is that you use to try to make an improvement, graphene or some magical pixie dust, there isn't that much left to squeeze out of it. So to have a real non-incremental improvement, a 5x delta, you need a different process technology, something which operates in a fundamentally different way.
That's the question.
And at that, you can really only get about a 2 to 3x improvement just based on thermodynamics. Right? So we have to have realistic expectations.
Should we be investing more in magical pixie dust?
I think anytime we have a public investment, we want to make sure that the public's getting something out of it. And, you know, I think that we know that, you know, folks like Eric and others that are doing some really great work at UCLA, I think, you know, should be investing in them and seeing what they can come up with.
Cool. All right. I think our time is drawing to a close. Did you guys have any final words? You have a chance for a final statement.
I don't feel the need to. I think we both wrote out some notes for a closing statement, so if you want to go ahead.
Sure. You know, California is not the first place or only place that's dealt with water scarcity issues, and you know, we can look to places like Israel, where desalination has been done rather successfully. It's a place where, you know, LA gets about 14 inches of rain a year. Israel averages about 4 inches. They're the place that pioneered drip irrigation, and they recycle over 90% of their water. They exhausted all the other options first before investing in desalination. That's a place where it's been done successful. You look at Australia, which during their millennium drought, they had a 12-year drought, and they kind of threw everything at it. They spent $10 billion building 6 desalination plants. They invested in conservation. You know, no one has a swimming pool in Australia anymore. It's frowned upon. And they have 4 of their desal plants, which are now defunct. And I know at least one of the communities has to pay some, like, hundreds of millions of dollars a year for a holding charge for a plant that's sitting idle. They found that conservation and efficiency in some of their alternatives were sufficient for meeting their needs. And I think that those are lessons, both of those are lessons that we should take with us as we pursue long-term reliability and affordability here in California.
Thank you very much. Very good.
To say we have a lot of options. I would say there's still a lot of room for improvement in all aspects of how we manage water resources. Desalination is not the only option, and it's an imperfect option. But so are most other options. Not necessarily equally imperfect, but similarly imperfect. And desal really should be the option of last resort. When you have no other option and you need fresh water, it's available. We know how to do it, we know what the impacts are, we know how to mitigate the impacts, and if that's your only option, it's a lot cheaper than bottled water or trucking water. And so there it is. Great.
A round of applause for both of our panelists.
Big round of applause again for our moderator, Toby, for Tracy, and Eric. They did a terrific job. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you, really. You know, motto at procon.org is understand the issues, understand each other. That's what it's all about. I think we did that tonight as the sun was setting over the Pacific Ocean. I don't know if you noticed, at some point there was dolphins back here. It's a beautiful place to have a public policy discussion. I want to give a couple of thank yous and a couple announcements, and then we're done for the night. One, I just want to say the music you heard before the debate started tonight was from DJ Airy Pop. DJ is going to be spinning tunes for the next 30 minutes or so, so hang around, have a good time. The artist here tonight is Daniel. Daniel has been recording the words from our speakers tonight and visually representing them on this canvas. So this is a reflection of tonight's debate. And if you want an opportunity to go up close and check it out, please do. Our booths are going to be open. If you haven't registered to vote, you can. If you haven't written to your elected official, not sure who it is, there's still time. If you want to check out a book from the Santa Monica Public Library, please do. And finally, before you leave, make sure you vote. There's a magnetic board with a pro and a con, before and after votes. Make sure you stick your magnet on whichever side of the debate you stand on. I also want to give a special thank you to our co-hosts for tonight, and I apologize for not acknowledging their important purpose here tonight. That is UCLA's Institute for the Environment and Sustainability. Thank you, UCLA. We're so grateful that you participated in tonight's discussion. Go Bruins, I'm a two-time Bruin, so we're especially proud to have you here tonight. And I want to say to the regulars, has anyone been to a pro-con discussion more than tonight? Any regulars here? To our regulars, thank you, thank you. We hope to make regulars of you all. Come back next Monday, where our topic is going to be whether or not to abolish ICE. It's going to be a good one, folks. Come on back. Thank you again. And if you, and before I forget, make sure you check out Up Close and Political. It's a podcast that's available. It's really, really funny and really enlightening too. Encourage everyone to check it out. Thanks again to our sponsor, the Arthur and Rupe Foundation. Good night, folks. We'll see you next week.